It's great to be here today, and thanks everyone for coming. I want to thank Martine and Melissa and Dina for joining us here today and helping us with this session, and I know it'll be a good one. I wanted to speak at this session for a couple reasons. Mark just knows I just went off my script. I'm not good with scripts. The two reasons. One, I believe very deeply that we need to have a healthy, balanced workplace that meets the needs of our very diverse workforce. And I believe that strongly. And therefore I try to do things that will help that. And I know that's why all of you are here today. So one of the things I do in my spare time is I'm the executive sponsor for DNET, which is really an affinity group of a large number of individuals with disabilities within government who are coming together to try to address some of the issues that they have. And to the extent that people want to join or are interested in helping, I know they would always appreciate that. So, and likely that my desire to be part of that and help that organization is, I have a long history of working in the disabilities area, going back to my time in ComSoc. So something I feel very strongly, and like I suspect most people in the room and in the province and in the country, there are people in my family with disabilities, visible and hidden, and therefore it strikes home, and you want to help. So the other thing I guess I want to say is tell a little bit of a story in that in a previous deputy job, and I've had a few, so it'll be hard for you to guess which one. I knew a couple of staff members quite well, and they both suffered from mental disabilities, which required them to take time off work periodically, and they were lucky that they had great managers actually who understood and accommodated, and it worked well for them, and you know, they got their stuff done, but every while, sometimes a year or two, they would need an extended period off work, just to deal with what they had to deal with. And I think that's great, and I had tremendous respect for those managers that they were able to do that, and they were understanding. But frankly, it was luck. It was luck that they had understanding, capable managers who knew the value of their employees and knew enough to accommodate and assist, because their overall contribution was invaluable. And I think it's time for all disabilities, but maybe particularly invisible disabilities, that it be more than just luck. That the organization itself have a culture of understanding and accommodation and working with these individuals to do things that assist them, and that we have appropriate policies and stuff. And I know that's hopefully the session today can talk about how we develop that culture and how we develop those understandings and how we spread it not only amongst staff but also amongst managers. And that was really the message I wanted to bring today. I know you're talking about episodic disabilities and invisible disabilities today, and I just think it's an area that I think we're doing some great stuff on it within the two ministries and within the OPS, and there's lots more to do if we truly want to become a diverse workplace. And I would say it's more than a diverse workplace. I don't think. I likely work long hours just like everyone else, but I'm a strong believer that people have to have a balance in their life, and that work-life balance has to be there. You likely saw my blog where I walk home at night. I walked home last night, so I'm still a little stiff, but you have to do those things, and I actually think that part of the being a good workplace that will help people who have have certain disabilities, certain perhaps mental disabilities most of all, that if we have that balance, that we think about stress, we think about how we organize our work, the pressures that we're putting on people, both formally and informally, and just be a little bit more loose and casual sometimes, I think will go a long way. I found that being a little bit more informal, being a little bit more flexible, doesn't mean that there's a decline in the product or a decline in the amount people work. They just work differently. And in this day and age, surely, with technology and everything else, we can work differently. So I guess that's my plea, and it's great to see you all here, kind of talking about this and doing this, and I look forward to hearing the results of today's panel, and thanks for the coffee.
Thanks for coming. Fabulous
Thank you.
message. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marg and Deputy Minister, for your opening remarks, and Deputy Minister, for your leadership in championing invisible disabilities. This is very encouraging for us to hear. And the Canadian Working Group on HIV and Rehabilitation is very pleased to be here today. And as Marg and Deputy Minister said, Deanna, Melissa and I will be talking to you about how you can better manage people living with episodic disabilities in the workplace. So that's what we're going to be discussing here today. So just an overview of the presentation. We will first start by discussing quickly what and who the Canadian Working Group on HIV and Rehabilitation is, and what we mean by an episodic disability, and how episodic disabilities differ from our traditional understanding of disabilities. We will then discuss some of the challenges facing people living with episodic disabilities, and then hear from Deanna Mansanki about her experience living and working with an episodic disability. We will then conclude by talking to you about how you, as employers, can better support people living with episodic disabilities. We'll also discuss the role of co-workers and what additional workplace supports are available to people living with episodic disabilities. So first off, a little bit about the Canadian Working Group on HIV and Rehabilitation, QWIGR for short. QWIGR is, as Marg mentioned, a national charitable and interdisciplinary organization that bridges the traditionally separate worlds of HIV, disability, and rehabilitation. And our primary goal is to improve the lives of people living with HIV through rehabilitation research, education, policy, and practice. Now, as we know, QWIGR was set up in the late 1990s as people living with HIV who had access to treatment began to live longer. But also, as they began to live longer, they began to live with a number of health-related challenges. And rehabilitation can make a difference by helping people living with HIV remain healthy, remain active in their communities, and participate in the workforce and in their communities. So, while QWIGR's work is centered on meeting the needs of people living with HIV, we also work with other disability and rehabilitation groups from a cross-disability perspective, because what we've found is that people living with HIV are experiencing similar challenges as people living with other types of episodic disabilities. So we undertake collaborative research, knowledge exchange, and we coordinate a number of interdisciplinary and cross-disability networks, such as the Episodic Disability Network, and the Ontario Episodic Disability Network. And we'll be discussing those in a little bit more detail later on in the presentation. So, as we know, and as was mentioned, human capital is an organization's greatest asset. And whether your organization is large or small, recruiting and retaining the best workforce possible is fundamental to the organization's success. And we know that there are challenges recruiting and retaining people living with episodic disabilities. In order to better understand the needs of people living with episodic disabilities and identify organizational gaps and improve policies and guidelines, it's essential to begin by understanding what we mean by an episodic disability. And this is where we will begin here today. So maybe now I'll ask you to talk about what you understand by an episodic disability. Maybe you can talk to your neighbor or voice a few opinions to the larger group of what your understanding of an episodic disability is.
Well, I'm just going to take a stab because I don't know. So my guess would be that, as opposed to say living with a learning disability, which is with you 24/7, and constantly, you may need some kind of accommodation for that on a day-to-day basis. An episodic disability is one that it emerges at certain points in time or for periods of time, and in other times may be sort of more dormant or not an issue, and so you only have to deal with this at those times. Occasional times, I don't know how frequent they might be, but it's not a day-to-day, it's not necessarily 24/7.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone have anything else to add to that? I mean, that's pretty much it, and we'll go on to yeah, exactly. Go ahead.
My understanding, and I also don't know that well, but I think when some people think of it being episodic, they think of it just being physical, but I don't think it's necessarily limited to just a physical disability. Mm-hmm. There's all kinds of different things that can come up, mental health issues and that kind of thing. So I think it's broader than just,
physical.
The physical piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've touched on two very, very important parts, and I'll go on to sort of discuss these now, I guess. And what I'm going to be discussing is looking at episodic disabilities from the context of HIV. So we'll take HIV as one example of an episodic disability. So as we know, and as I mentioned, people living with HIV are living longer. Those obviously with access to antiretroviral treatments. So HIV is no longer considered imminently fatal. There is still no cure for it, but people living with HIV are living longer. And so HIV is now considered more of a complex chronic condition. However, as a result of living longer, people living with HIV are also experiencing a number of health-related challenges. And what are these challenges? Body function and structural impairments. So difficulties resulting from living with HIV and all the side effects of its treatment. So pain, fatigue, activity limitations, so difficulty carrying out day-to-day activities such as walking, going grocery shopping, and participation restrictions, so difficulties working, retaining not only employment but personal relationships. Now, we collectively term all of these health-related challenges disability, and what we understand by disability is anything that interferes with meaningful and active living. So disabilities can be anything from a physical ailment to a lack of social support to a policy that is not inclusive or does not help people living with HIV retain employment. So it's a broader spectrum we're looking at. And the way in which these disabilities are experienced, as you pointed out, is episodic in nature. So they come and they go. Someone does not know when they are going to be ill and for how long they're going to be ill. So this is why we often refer to HIV as an unpredictable episodic disability. Now, HIV, as I mentioned, is one example of an episodic disability. But if you think about it, everybody knows someone living with an episodic disability. Conditions such as multiple sclerosis, lupus, diabetes, some forms of mental illness, cancer. And features that distinguish episodic disabilities are their unpredictability and fluctuating periods of illness and wellness. Now, as you mentioned, a disability is generally understood as something lifelong and relatively consistent. But episodic disabilities have intermittent periods of good and not so good health. And if we think about it, this unpredictability can have a negative impact on employment participation, income support, access to care and services, and social inclusion. I'll take, more of a sort of personal approach, but in speaking to someone living with an episodic disability, they describe this metaphor as being a great way of exemplifying their experience and the unpredictability of living with an episodic disability. And they described this painting by a Japanese artist, Hokusai. And I'm going to read this. And there's a big tidal wave, as you can see, and all around there are these smaller tidal waves, and there are these long, elegant rowboats, and they're trying to make their way through the stormy sea. And they're on the brink of being destroyed and snapped to pieces. And yet somehow they're able to glide through this stormy sea. And to me, this really sums it up, what one person's experience might be like living with an episodic disability. So the bigger waves and the smaller waves. And we're going to be talking about this in terms of research that's being conducted in terms of experiencing bigger episodes and smaller episodes that someone might experience over their health trajectory. Now going to direct you to some research that's been undertaken by Kelly O'Brien from the University of Toronto, in which the Canadian Working Group on HIV and Rehabilitation partnered with Kelly O'Brien on this. This was developed as part of a qualitative research study, and a series of 38 different focus groups and interviews were conducted with adults living with HIV. And participants were asked about their health-related challenges living with HIV and how these impacted their overall health. So this diagram that we're going to be seeing really sort of shows what one person's experience might be like living with an episodic disability. Episodes can be major, as you can see in these 3 episodes here. And these may be caused by a big life event, such as a death in the family, and, or losing a job, for example. However, as you can see over there, there are minor fluctuations that someone might experience over the course of a day. And in fact, if you think about it, we all feel high and low points during the course of the day, but these are manageable, and we're able to continue participating in society and remaining active in employment. So there are these sort of the bigger episodes and the smaller ones that occur superimposed over these. And this diagram is going to explain this further in detail and how all these 3 dimensions, so there's the dimensions, the triggers, and the contextual factors are coming together. For example, someone finds out they're living with HIV. This results in an episode, an illness-related episode. Stigma, discrimination, and stress can exacerbate the episode. However, extrinsic contextual factors, such as social supports, and intrinsic contextual factors, such as positive living behaviors, can restore somebody to health, back to health. However, another episode, an illness-related episode, might occur, such as an opportunistic infection of someone living with HIV that results in hospitalization. So again, we see the illness-related episode. And then a restoring back to health through social supports and other supports that are available. And superimposed on all these larger episodes are the minor episodes and fluctuations that someone might experience during the course of a day. So this really exemplifies what someone's experience might be like, not only living with HIV, but living with other forms of episodic disabilities. Now, how can this framework be used? People living with episodic disabilities can use it to better understand and describe the health-related challenges they are experiencing. Frontline care workers can use it to ask questions about the health-related challenges facing people living with episodic disabilities. And policymakers can use it to help guide them in their programs and policies. Now, an increasing number of Canadians are living with episodic disabilities. 20% of Canadians will experience an illness-related episode in their life. 2 million Canadians have diabetes. 63,000 Canadians are living with HIV. And 4 million Canadians are affected with arthritis. These combined numbers are staggering. And the concept of episodic disabilities is an innovative approach to understanding many lifelong disabling conditions prevalent in Canadian society. Now, not everybody living with an episodic disability is experiencing illness-related episodes that move them in and out of the workforce. However, these figures really provide an indication of the number of Canadians who may be impacted by episodic disability-related challenges. And therefore, we need to be addressing the challenges facing people living with episodic disabilities. And this leads me to the next part, which is the initiation of the episodic disability movement. Healthcare providers, institutions, and organizations often separate themselves into distinct condition and in a siloed approach. For example, we have multiple sclerosis, mental illness, arthritis, and HIV. However, and these tend to operate autonomously despite having experiences that are shared amongst these different episodic disability groups. And in light of this, QIGA, the Canadian Working Group on HIV and Rehabilitation, in 2003 began to work from this cross-disability approach. And what was interesting is that physiotherapists, which as Mark mentioned, we work a lot with physiotherapists, began to notice that people living with multiple sclerosis were facing some similar challenges as people living with HIV. So instead of adopting this sort of siloed approach, why don't we work together on those issues of common concern? And in 2003, we developed the Episodic Disability Network. And the Episodic Disability Network is a network of organizations representing different episodic disability groups, insurers, employers, physiotherapists and other rehabilitation professionals, government. And the aim of this is really to create a platform and a forum where people and all these different key stakeholders can come together and discuss some of the issues facing people living with episodic disabilities that are of common concern. Employment and income support have been articulated to be the two most important issues facing people living with episodic disability that span across disability. And in 2009, so recently, we developed the provincial counterpart of the National Episodic Disability Network in Ontario, the Ontario Episodic Disability Network. And this network is really focusing on trying to meet the needs of people living with episodic disabilities in Ontario by undertaking collaborative research, knowledge exchange, and working together on policy, practice, and education issues. QIGA has also done a lot of work in education from a cross-disability perspective. In fact, we developed the Managing Episodic Disability course, which is a course for human resource professionals to help them be better able to support people living with episodic disabilities in the workplace. We've also developed a framework that articulates the need for Canada to have a national episodic disability strategy. So as we know, there are strategies for cancer, HIV, but there isn't a national episodic disability strategy. And we've produced an initial discussion paper that articulates the need to have a national episodic disability strategy. And the first action that needs to happen for that to move forward would be to convene a national policy dialogue of all these key stakeholders to come together. So the employers, insurers, government, people living with episodic disability, disability organizations to come together and discuss what the challenges are and how we can move this forward in a collaborative cross-disability approach. So these are just but a few examples of some of the work we've been doing from this cross-disability and cross-sectoral approach. So what are some of the challenges facing people living with episodic disabilities? And we've undertaken a lot of research, and from the research, these are some of the main challenges that have come up. So we need a definition. What we find is that most income support programs in Canada do not always recognize the episodic nature of many disabilities. And when they do, there are varying definitions, policies, and practices. Why? Because these are designed for different purposes by different jurisdictions. So it makes it very, very challenging for someone living with an episodic disability to try and navigate the maze of programs and services that are available. And the next one is we need access to services. This has been, constantly articulated to us by people living with episodic disabilities. There are disparate access to care and services in various geographical regions. And there's also differences between urban and rural settings. So this is a big challenge for people living with episodic disabilities. Workplace and employment is another very big issue. People living with episodic disabilities face barriers to employment. They face difficulties related to medication, difficulties in regards to lack of having flexible workplace policies and guidelines that acknowledge the realities and the physical and mental and social realities of living with episodic disabilities. Another challenge that they face is income security. And if you think about it, due specifically to the episodic nature of many of these disabilities, someone is constantly moving in and out of the workforce. And when they're unemployed, they need to rely on disability income support programs to provide them with the income security that they need. However, what we see is that many of these disability income support programs, as I mentioned, do not always recognize the episodic nature of these different disabilities, and when they do, there are varying definitions. So this lack of integration and coordination makes it challenging, as I mentioned, for people to navigate these programs. Now, the government spent an estimated, government, private sector, and quasi-government bodies spent an estimated $28 billion in 2008-2009 in direct income support programs. However, without any comprehensive oversight respecting what the programs do as a whole and what they aim to achieve for Canadians with disabilities. So there tends to be a lack of comprehensive oversight for these programs and lack of interjurisdictional coordination. And what we find is also that not only is there this lack of coordination, but current policies and legislations, in fact, often act as a disincentive to labour force participation for people living with episodic disabilities who can participate in the labour force intermittently. In fact, what we find is that many people living with episodic disabilities tell us that they want to work and they want to go back to work, but they fear going back to work because they will lose their income support programs, their extended health benefits. And the unknown is very scary to them of having to go back to work, maybe go to an employer that doesn't have an extended health benefit plan, to then be ill and have to return, leave work and have to try to get back onto the income support program system. So there's a lot of challenges that people are facing in terms of coming in and out of the workforce. And we're finding that some of these programs and policies are in fact deterrents for people to go back to work. So in terms of, moving this forward, is that people living with episodic disabilities, as I mentioned, feel that they may be in a worse financial situation if they return to work part-time. And what is needed is more flexible disability income support programs that would facilitate labour force participation of Canadians with episodic disabilities, obviously consistent with their capabilities. So we're constantly trying to think about creative solutions in order to help people living with episodic disabilities participate in the labour force when their health permits them to do so. And that this would be a win-win for everybody, for people living with episodic disabilities, for the Canadian society, and the government as a whole. So now that we've discussed some of the sort of broader systemic issues and discussed what an episodic disability is, I'd like to hand it over to Deanna Mansanki, who will talk about her experience living and working with an episodic disability.